"Don't touch me." The words cut through the laughter and clinking glasses like a blade. Richard Whitfield, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, and wearing the kind of arrogance money buys, jerked his arm away as though Angela herself carried disease. He towered over her, his icy glare fixed on the young black woman who stood frozen with a tray in her trembling hands. The evening had started like any other at Le Bernardin's private dining hall. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over marble floors, while servers in crisp uniforms moved like shadows between tables of the city's elite. Angela had been working these events for 3 years, invisible to most, essential to all. She knew the rhythm: arrive early, smile politely, serve perfectly, and disappear into the background of their glittering world. But tonight was different. Richard Whitfield held court at the center table, surrounded by investors and politicians who hung on his every word. His booming laugh dominated the room as he recounted another tale of financial conquest, another company acquired, another competitor crushed. "Power," he declared, raising his wine glass, "belongs to those bold enough to take it." The room erupted in applause. Angela had been clearing glasses from the adjacent table when it happened. A simple accident. Her elbow brushed against his shoulder as she reached for a champagne flute. The contact lasted barely a second, lighter than a feather's touch. But to Richard, it was an unforgivable transgression. "Do you know who I am?" He sneered, his lips curling with disgust. "Do you think people like you can put your hands on me?" His voice carried the entitled fury of a man who had never been told no in his adult life. The restaurant stilled. Forks lowered mid-bite. Waiters froze mid-step, their professional smiles faltering. Every eye turned to Angela, a woman who had worked double shifts to make ends meet, who carried herself with quiet dignity, despite being overlooked and underestimated. Her chest heaved, her knuckles whitened against the silver tray, but her voice managed to emerge, thin and trembling. "Sir, it was an accident. I didn't mean—" Slap. The crack echoed through the marble hall like a gunshot. Time seemed to suspend itself in that moment. The tray fell from Angela's hands in slow motion, glasses shattering on the polished floor, wine splashing crimson against her black shoes like spilled blood. Gasps rippled across the room like a wave. Someone whispered, "Did he really just hit her?" But no one stood. No one intervened. A woman in diamonds clutched her pearl necklace, her mouth agape. A senator who had been mid-sentence stopped speaking entirely, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. The mayor's wife covered her eyes as if not seeing could undo what had happened. But the security cameras mounted discreetly in the corners, captured everything with digital precision. Richard leaned forward, his breath hot against Angela's ear, his voice low but carrying enough for the entire hall to hear. "This is your place. Serving, cleaning, picking up after the powerful. Never forget, without me, without people like me, you're nothing." His words dripped with the venom of generations of entitlement, each syllable designed to cut deeper than the physical blow. Angela staggered, her cheek burning, her eyes welling with tears that refused to fall, but she held her head high. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was defiance. That quiet refusal to bow her head, to grovel for forgiveness she didn't owe, unsettled some of the diners more than the slap itself. A prominent banker shifted uncomfortably in his chair. A woman clutched her husband's arm, whispering urgently. A young tech CEO reached for his phone, then thought better of it. Then came the laughter. Cold, sharp, poisonous. From Richard's inner circle, from men in tailored suits who owed their positions to his favor, from women in glittering gowns who had learned to survive by echoing powerful men's cruelty. They smirked, whispering cruel jokes as if her pain were the evening's entertainment. "Well, someone finally put the help in their place," chuckled a hedge fund manager. "About time someone reminded them where they stand," added his wife, her diamonds catching the light as she nodded approvingly. Angela knelt slowly, her hands trembling as she gathered the broken glass. Her fingertips bled where shards bit into her skin, crimson drops mixing with the spilled wine. A hush fell again, thick and uncomfortable. Some watched with pity but looked away quickly, as though her suffering was contagious. Others leaned forward eagerly, desperate not to miss a single moment of her humiliation. And Richard? He smiled. A cruel, satisfied smile, savoring her degradation like fine wine. "That's it," he murmured loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "On your knees. Where you belong." The words hit harder than his hand had. Angela's heart pounded, her face flushed hot with shame and rage. But she kept going. Piece by piece she picked up the fragments, her blood mixing with the expensive wine. She bit her lip to stop the tears from falling, to deny him the satisfaction of seeing her break completely. What no one in that restaurant understood was that this moment, this slap, this public humiliation, was not the end of Angela Carter's story. It was the spark, the beginning of a storm that would strip Richard Whitfield of everything he had built on arrogance and cruelty. In the corner booth, a young analyst named Marcus Wilson sat frozen, his expensive meal forgotten. He had grown up in the projects, earned scholarships to Harvard, clawed his way into this world of wealth and power. But watching Angela on her knees, bleeding and humiliated, he saw his own mother, his own sister, himself before the suits and degrees had given him armor. His hands shook as he pulled out his phone. 2 tables away, Elena Rodriguez, a civil rights attorney, discreetly activated her phone's recording function. She had come as someone's guest, bored by the usual political theater, but now her legal mind was already cataloging witnesses, calculating damages, building a case. Near the kitchen door, Maria Santos, another server, watched with tears in her eyes. She had worked alongside Angela for 2 years, knew about her night school classes, her dreams of something better. Maria's own experience with powerful men's wandering hands and cruel words came flooding back. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Angela didn't quit that night. She finished her shift with the quiet precision of someone who refuses to let humiliation define the rest of the evening. Her cheek throbbed, her hands stung from the cuts, but she served coffee, cleared dessert plates, and maintained the professional smile that had become her armor. After the last guest departed and the doors locked, she stood at the stainless steel sink in the kitchen, washing wine and blood from her hands as warm water stung the tiny cuts she'd earned while collecting glass. The night manager, David Chen, approached hesitantly. He was a good man trapped in an impossible position, caught between corporate policies and human decency. "Angela, I'm so sorry. I should have stepped in. I wanted to, but..." His voice trailed off, heavy with the weight of his own cowardice. "Richard Whitfield owns half the board that owns this place. If I had intervened..." Angela nodded once, not because she agreed, but because she understood the fragile mathematics of survival that governed people like them. On her way out through the staff entrance, she found a folded note tucked under her purse. No name, just a sentence in careful handwriting. "I saw everything. If you ever need a witness, I will stand up. A friend." By morning, the adrenaline had crystallized into cold determination. Angela took the early bus to the public library, her usual stop before beginning her second job at a coffee shop downtown. She pulled out the scholarship application she kept in her bag, the one she updated between tables and during bus rides, preparing for night classes in business analytics that might unlock doors that had remained sealed since college loans rerouted her original plans. She'd grown up in a house where her grandmother taught dignity as a daily discipline, how to iron a shirt as if it might be inspected by angels, how to sign your name like you expected it to matter, how to walk with your spine straight even when the world tried to bend you double. That lesson had carried her through years of double shifts and quiet hunger. It steadied her now. What Richard took last night wasn't her worth. It was only her silence, and even that he would not keep for long. On her phone, an unread message blinked from an unfamiliar number. I was at table 14 last night. My name is Elena Rodriguez. I'm an employment attorney and I'd like to help you. Angela stared at the message for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the reply button. She had learned early that help from strangers often came with hidden costs, that people who offered salvation usually expected gratitude that looked like servitude. But something in the straightforward tone of the message, the lack of pity or condescension, made her reconsider. Angela didn't answer immediately. She stacked plates at the coffee shop, filled water glasses, measured out each breath until the tremor left her hands. People from the night before appeared throughout the day like ghosts from a half-remembered nightmare. Some offered sidelong glances heavy with unspoken apology. Others provided clipped kindness, the mechanical sympathy of people who wanted to help without risk. 2 customers spoke loudly near her station, rehearsing their shock as though denial might undo what they'd witnessed. "I heard it was blown out of proportion," said one woman, her voice carrying the desperate hope of someone trying to convince herself. "These things always are," replied her companion. "Rich men are such easy targets these days." Near the window booth, Marcus Wilson, the young analyst from the night before, sat alone with his laptop. When Angela approached to refill his coffee, he slid a business card under his napkin. Their eyes met briefly, his filled with apology that dared not speak itself aloud, hers acknowledging the courage it had taken for him to return, to be seen associating with her even in this small way. When the lunch rush thinned, Angela stepped into the alley behind the coffee shop and called Elena's number. The voice that answered was calm, unhurried, and precise. No dramatic promises or emotional appeals, just the steady confidence of someone who had walked this path before. "I've been doing employment law for 15 years, Elena explained. "I've represented servers, executives, nurses, engineers. The job title changes, but the pattern never does. Powerful people think they can treat others as disposable, and they're usually right until someone decides to stand up." Angela listened as Elena outlined options. Filing complaints with state agencies, documenting everything, identifying witnesses, approaching the restaurant management first, then escalating to regulators if needed. "This doesn't have to set you on fire to keep other people warm," Elena said quietly. "There are ways to seek justice that protect you too." For the first time since the slap, Angela felt something other than anger or humiliation. She felt hope. The restaurant's owner, Jonathan Pierce, called an emergency staff meeting that evening after closing. He stood before the assembled servers, cooks, and managers, his usually confident demeanor replaced by obvious discomfort. "What happened last night was unfortunate," he began, the word hanging in the air like stale cigarette smoke. "We pride ourselves on being a safe space for both guests and staff, and what occurred doesn't represent our values." The words arranged themselves into a familiar pattern. Care that looked like legal caution, concern that sounded like damage control. "However," Pierce continued, "any public statements about this incident could jeopardize all of our jobs. Mr. Whitfield is influential. I'm going to handle this quietly by reaching out to him directly, smooth over any tensions." Angela watched the expressions around the room, some nodding in relieved agreement, others exchanging skeptical glances, a few staring at the floor in shame. "Has the security footage been preserved?" she asked, her voice cutting through the careful corporate speak. Pierce shifted uncomfortably. "Of course. As a matter of policy, all footage is maintained for legal purposes." 2 dishwashers in the back exchanged a look that said they'd seen policies change when convenience demanded it. That night, Angela walked home through streets that felt different somehow, as if the city itself had shifted while she wasn't looking. On her kitchen table, she spread out a notebook and began writing the only timeline that matters in situations where truth competes with power. Date, time, action, witnesses, exact words spoken. She wrote until her hand cramped, documenting every detail she could remember, every face that had turned away, every laugh that had cut deeper than glass. Meanwhile, across town, Richard Whitfield woke to the kind of morning he had always assumed belonged to him by right. His penthouse apartment overlooked Central Park, a testament to decades of calculated ruthlessness dressed up as business acumen. His assistant had already arranged his calls, his driver waited downstairs, and the morning's board packet rested on the credenza he'd never had to dust himself. At the office, Richard held court in his usual fashion, retelling the previous night's events with strategic edits. How he'd been accosted by incompetent staff, how standards were decaying throughout the service industry, how people these days lacked the proper respect for their betters. His vice president, Thomas Bradley, laughed in all the right places, another middle-aged white man auditioning for proximity to power. But later, when Richard left for a client luncheon, Bradley closed his office door and opened his computer to find 7 emails with variations of the same subject line. Last night, what I witnessed, we need to talk. Marcus Wilson had sent the longest message, 3 pages of careful corporate language that still managed to convey moral outrage. He described witnessing the assault, his inability to reconcile leadership behavior with company values, and his belief that silence would make them all complicit. 2 major clients had sent identical single-sentence messages. If your firm takes no action regarding last night's incident, we will, and we will not be alone. A junior partner who had been celebrating her promotion at a corner table wrote, I have 2 daughters. They deserve to live in a world where men like Richard Whitfield face consequences. If you do nothing, I'll find people who will do something. Elena Rodriguez moved with the deliberate patience of someone who understood that speed was often the enemy of justice. She met with Angela twice more, asking for facts rather than feelings, then honoring the feelings by creating space for them. Together, they began collecting statements from those willing to go on record and those who preferred to remain anonymous, but would agree to be contacted if legal proceedings required it. The woman with the pearl necklace, Mrs. Catherine Ashford, wrote a carefully worded but damning paragraph that carried more weight than most speeches because of its measured tone and her social standing. Marcus Wilson produced a detailed account that read like a legal brief, the kind of truth that spills when a person realizes they want a career they can name without shame. Maria Santos provided testimony about the workplace culture, other incidents she'd witnessed, the pattern of behavior that made last night predictable rather than aberrant. The restaurant owner, now aware that copies of the security footage existed in multiple locations and that several prominent witnesses were coordinating their accounts, began reaching out with the standard lexicon of corporate crisis management. Unfortunate incident, isolated behavior, doesn't reflect our values, committed to a thorough review. Elena listened to his voicemail, then called him back with a simple response. Please read the city's anti-discrimination statutes, specifically the section on public accommodations. I'll wait while you look it up. It would have been easy to post the security footage online and let social media burn for Angela's sake, but she chose something more sustainable. Elena filed a formal complaint with the State Human Rights Agency, then notified the restaurant management in writing so they could not later claim ignorance. A copy of the complaint, precise and professional, went to Whitfield Capital's head of compliance with a single sentence added at the end. Please treat this as formal notice of potential liability. The phrase wasn't a threat. It was a key turning in a lock that had kept certain doors closed for too long. Inside Richard's firm, Janet Walsh, the chief risk officer, read the complaint twice, then immediately called the general counsel. She had survived 3 market crashes and 2 major scandals by recognizing the early warning signs of institutional collapse. If this were on tomorrow's front page, she asked, would we be proud of our response today? The question hung in the air, like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to spread. Richard took the first call from board member Harrison Clark as a minor annoyance, the second as a personal insult, and the third as the opening salvo of a war that surprised him only because he had believed certain rules would never change. Clark, the board chairman who had made his fortune in tech before moving into finance, was known for preferring compromise to conflict, consensus to confrontation. Richard, I need clarity on this situation from last night, he said without preamble. The incident at Le Bernardin. Richard gave him the carefully crafted version he'd been perfecting. Provocation by insolent staff, overreaction by emotional witnesses, media hysteria over nothing. Clark listened without interruption, then asked the quiet question, "No false narrative survives. Is there security footage of what actually happened?" "Of course not," Richard replied smoothly. "These places don't record private dining areas, privacy concerns, you understand." "Actually, Richard," Clark said softly, "I already have a copy. Multiple copies, in fact. Would you like to revise your account?" There is a particular kind of silence men make when they realize they have catastrophically overestimated their own invincibility. It is not the silence of apology or reflection. It is the absence of swagger, the sound of armor cracking. Richard felt it settle around him like cold water. Over the following days, people who had always nodded began to pause before speaking in his presence. Subordinates who had always hurried to open doors began letting him reach for his own handles. The small rituals of deference that had structured his days started disappearing, one by one, like lights going out in a building he'd always assumed would stand forever. What do you think the board should do at this moment? Remove Richard immediately or give him a chance to redeem himself? Let us know in the comments. Angela kept working through it all. That choice felt radical in a world that expected victims to vanish for the convenience of everyone else's comfort. She greeted regular customers, refilled water glasses, and learned to recognize the specific type of kindness that emerges after public harm. Unpracticed, awkward, but genuinely well-intentioned. One evening, she found a small potted plant on the corner of the coffee shop counter with a note tucked beneath. "For your kitchen window, from someone who believes you deserved better." It was objectively a small thing, but in every way that mattered, it was a vote cast for a world where one night's cruelty would not define the shape of all the nights that followed. When Elena called with updates, she never promised victory. She promised process, and she kept every small promise exactly on time. Angela wrote that down in her notebook. Promises kept on time are a form of medicine. The emergency board meeting took place on a Thursday morning in the same glass conference room where Richard had celebrated countless victories. 12 directors assembled around the mahogany table, their faces reflecting the gravity of men and women who understood that some decisions cannot be undone. The presentation was clinical, devastating in its precision. Angela's sworn testimony, witness statements, employment law citations, and the security footage that played without commentary, the sound of the slap echoing in the sterile room like a gavel falling. Richard sat rigid, his jaw clenched, eyes darting between faces that had once reflected his confidence back to him, but now seemed carved from marble. "Mr. Whitfield," Chairman Clark began with careful formality, "this is not merely an unfortunate incident or a public relations challenge. This represents a fundamental breach of the values this firm claims to uphold, and it has created legal and financial exposure we cannot ignore." Richard's fist hit the table with practiced force. Are we really destroying decades of success over one exaggeration? She's a waitress, for God's sake. You're going to let her destroy everything we've built? Director Sarah Chen, whose venture capital fund had been one of Richard's most reliable allies, leaned forward with steel in her voice. "She's not just a waitress, Richard. She's a human being who was assaulted in public by someone representing this firm, and millions of people have now seen the footage." Another board member, Dr. Robert Martinez, added quietly, "We've lost 3 major contracts in 48 hours. A pension fund manager called yesterday to say his board won't do business with us if you remain. One of our partners told me her teenage daughter saw the video online. They asked her how she could work with people who hit women." Richard's face flushed red, his voice rising to the pitch of a man watching his empire crumble. "So this is what it comes to? A career destroyed by social media hysteria and misplaced sympathy?" "This is about leadership," Clark interjected, his tone cutting through the tension like a blade. "And accountability. We have to vote." For the first time in his professional life, Richard realized the room was no longer his to command. The votes were cast individually, each director stating their position aloud for the record. Remove. Remove. Remove immediately. 11 for immediate termination. 1 abstention from an old friend who couldn't bring himself to vote, but also couldn't defend the indefensible. None in Richard's favor. The verdict fell like a curtain on the final act of a play that had run too long. Richard sank back in his leather chair, but managed to force a bitter smile, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. You'll all regret this decision. Mark my words. No one answered. Silence had become his final inheritance. Angela, meanwhile, sat in the back row of the small classroom where she had enrolled in statistics just weeks earlier, unaware that across town, the empire that had once mocked her was collapsing from within. Her phone buzzed during the break. Elena's text was brief, professional, and earth-shaking. It's done. He's out. The board voted unanimously to terminate him immediately. Angela stared at the message for a long moment, then quietly showed it to the classmate sitting next to her, an older woman named Dorothy who had become something of a study partner. Is that good news or bad news? Dorothy asked. I'm not sure yet, Angela replied honestly. But it feels like the beginning of something new. The boardroom emptied slowly, chairs scraping against polished wood, whispered conversations trailing behind like the last notes of a funeral dirge. Richard remained seated, his fists pressed against the table, staring at the door as if sheer force of will could make someone, anyone, walk back in and undo the vote. But no one returned. He spoke aloud, half to himself, half to the ghosts of better days. After everything I built, after all I gave this company, this is how they repay loyalty? His voice cracked, more brittle than thunderous. At the far end of the room, James Liu, the board secretary who had been taking minutes, gathered his materials with unusual care. Richard's glare fixed on him like a laser. What are you staring at, boy? Richard snapped, the racism that had always lurked beneath his polished exterior finally surfacing without restraint. James, barely 2 years out of law school but old enough to recognize evil when it spoke directly to him, met Richard's eyes steadily. Respect, Mr. Whitfield. That's all anyone ever wanted from you. And you couldn't give it to a woman whose only crime was doing her job. He left without waiting for a reply, closing the door with the soft finality of a coffin lid. Richard sat alone in the conference room where he had once ruled like a king, hearing those words echo louder than his own slap had in the restaurant. Across town, Angela sat in a cafe with Elena, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had grown cold while they talked. Do you understand what just happened? Elena asked gently. It's not just that they removed him, it's that they moved quickly, decisively. No committee to study the issue, no leave of absence while things blow over. They cut him loose completely. Angela shook her head slowly, her voice still trembling with disbelief. But people like him always find a way back. They have connections, money, lawyers who know how to make problems disappear. Elena smiled with the confidence of someone who had seen this particular story reach its conclusion before. Not this time. This time was different because the whole world saw, and more importantly, because you showed them something they'd never seen before. What do you mean? Grace under fire. You didn't scream, didn't lash out, didn't give them any excuse to shift blame to you. Your dignity in that moment was more powerful than all his money and connections combined. Angela looked down at her hands, tears stinging her eyes as she remembered that night. You want to know what hurt most? It wasn't even the slap itself. It was the laughter afterward. Hearing all those people laugh at my pain, and for just a moment, I believed I deserved it. Her voice broke completely. But now I know I never did. Meanwhile, Richard's phone buzzed insistently. His wife's name appeared on the screen. He answered desperately, his voice carrying the hollow hope of a man grasping at vanishing lifelines. Susan, you heard about today? This is all temporary, you understand? Just politics and posturing. I'll be back within a month." Her reply cut through his delusion like winter wind. "Richard, don't come home tonight. The children saw the video online. They're ashamed of you. And frankly, so am I." His voice rose to a near shout. "I am this family. Without me, you'd all have nothing. No house, no schools, no lifestyle." Susan's voice didn't waver. "Without you, Richard, we'd have something you can't buy. We'd have peace." The line went dead. Richard hurled the phone across the empty conference room, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his legendary composure finally cracking completely. For the first time in decades, he was utterly, terrifyingly alone. But while Richard's empire unraveled thread by thread, Angela began to discover what it meant to rise from ashes that had seemed final. Invitations began arriving, universities asking her to speak about dignity and resistance, organizations offering platforms for her voice, journalists wanting to tell her story in her own words. Each time she stepped onto a stage or sat for an interview, she carried the memory of that ballroom with her, the sting on her cheek, the cruel laughter echoing off marble walls, and the moment she had chosen to hold her head high instead of bowing it in shame. At her first speaking engagement, a community college in Brooklyn, an older woman in the audience stood up during the question period. "How did you keep standing that night when the whole world seemed to be laughing at you?" Angela's answer came from some deep well of truth she hadn't known she possessed. "Because I realized that if I fell that night, he would win twice, once with his hand and once with my shame. I couldn't give him that second victory. It was all I had left to deny him." The audience erupted in sustained applause, many people rising to their feet, some wiping away tears. For Angela, the humiliation that had nearly destroyed her had become her testimony, and Richard's cruelty had written its own epitaph. 6 weeks later, the courtroom was standing room only. Reporters lined the press benches, cameras positioned for optimal angles, sketch artists capturing moments that would become historical record. Richard Whitfield sat at the defense table, his once immaculate appearance now showing the strain of sleepless nights and mounting legal bills. His expensive suit hung loosely on a frame worn down by the constant weight of public disgrace. The judge, the Honorable Margaret Chen, had a reputation for fairness tempered by absolute intolerance for abuse of power. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had seen every excuse power makes for itself. "We are here today to address charges of assault in the third degree, harassment, and civil rights violations committed by the defendant, Richard Whitfield, against Ms. Angela Carter." Whispers rippled through the packed gallery. Richard's attorney, an expensive corporate lawyer clearly uncomfortable with criminal defense work, attempted a final deflection. "Your Honor, my client was under enormous professional stress that evening, and what appeared to be assault was really just an unfortunate misunderstanding that has been blown out of all proportion by social media." Judge Chen cut him off with surgical precision. "Counselor, what this court saw on that security footage was not a misunderstanding. It was a calculated act of violence followed by deliberate humiliation." The final scene of this story played out not in a courtroom or boardroom, but in the same community college classroom where Angela had been studying statistics on the night Richard's empire began its fall. She had returned as the guest lecturer for a course on business ethics, sharing her story with students who would soon enter the professional world themselves. "Sometimes," she concluded, looking out at faces eager to learn from her experience, "it only takes one moment of unchecked cruelty to reveal someone's true character to the world. But it also only takes one moment of courage to change everything that comes after." The applause was warm, sustained, and genuine, the kind that comes from hearts changed rather than hands merely moving. After class, a young woman approached her, nervousness and determination warring in her expression. "Ms. Carter, I work part-time at a restaurant downtown, and there's this manager who—" She trailed off, but Angela understood. "Tell me," Angela said gently, "and then let's figure out what we can do about it." Outside, the city hummed with its usual energy, but something fundamental had shifted in its moral architecture. One slap had changed everything, not because violence had won, but because dignity had refused to be destroyed by it. Before you go, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.